Hey, what's up? Welcome back to another video. Today I'll be showing you guys how to prep some shoes to be customized, and if that sounds like something you're interested in, then just keep on watching. So what you'll need to prep your shoes is acetone and cotton pads, masking tape, vinyl tape, 3 different grits of sandpaper, an X-Acto knife, and of course leather paint and top coat to seal your project. So the first thing I'm going to do is use 3 different grits of sandpaper to prep the areas that crease the most on the shoes. You can find this sandpaper on angelusdirect.com, as well as paint, top coat, brushes, and a whole bunch of other tools that you'll need to customize shoes. You always want to start out with the more coarse grit, which is usually the lowest number in the pack. So I'm going to start out with this 400 grit and focus on the areas that crease the most, which is usually around the toe. I personally don't always sand down this area on every pair of custom shoes. I only recently started doing this. I honestly don't find it that necessary to do. I haven't been doing it much this past 3 years that I've been customizing, and I've had no issues with the paint cracking in the areas that crease the most. So once you've gone over with 1 grit, then you're going to want to go over with the 800 grit sandpaper. Once you're finished with that, then you go in with the finest grit, which is 1500. You want to try to avoid sanding over the stitching, because if you do go over it, it'll start to fray the thread and it just won't look as clean as it was before you started sanding. Once you're done sanding the areas that crease the most, you want to go in with a cotton pad dipped in acetone and take off the factory finish of the shoe. I like to do this about twice per shoe, so once I make my way around the entire shoe, I grab a new cotton pad and I do it all over again. You'll notice on your cotton pad there'll be a white residue left over on it. This means that the factory finish is coming off, which is exactly what you want. If you just paint right over the factory finish, the leather paint won't adhere to the pores of the leather and your artwork won't last as long. For the lace guard, I like to use a Q-tip dipped in acetone and go over all of the holes just to make sure that this has been prepped well enough so that when you're lacing your shoes, the paint won't rub off. After we've acetoned the entire shoe, I like to go in with some tape and just stick it all around the shoe to make sure that I've taken off any of the fuzzies left over from the cotton pad. Now I'm going to go in with some more masking tape that's about 2 inches wide and cover up the sole and the midsole. If you're painting by hand with a brush, you can skip this step, but I usually airbrush the base layers of my shoes, so I'm going to protect all of the areas that I don't want paint on. Then I'm going to use flexible vinyl tape that you can get off angelusdirect.com, but I'm going to use this different one that I found in my studio. With the flexible vinyl tape, you want to get as close to the leather as possible, but be careful that you don't put the tape on the leather, because once you take the tape off when you think you're all finished, there'll be a bunch of areas near the midsole that doesn't have paint on it, and you'll end up having to do a bunch of touch-ups. Because I'm airbrushing, I'm going to want to tape up all of the areas that I don't want paint to get on, and that includes the tongue and the sock line. I'm using this masking tape that I found off of Amazon that happens to stick very well to fabric. There are specific tapes that are meant to stick to fabric, which I've tried. They always end up lifting in the process of painting. So I go in with this masking tape, and just like taping off the midsole, I want to get as close to the leather as possible to make sure that the fabric doesn't get any paint on it. Again, you want to be very careful and make sure that the tape isn't on the leather, because then again, once you take off the tape, you'll notice that there's going to be a bunch of areas that you need to touch up. I always use a grocery bag to stuff inside the shoe, just to make sure that when I airbrush, none of the paint gets on the sock line. Now I'm going to tape off all of the areas that I want to keep white. When cutting the tape, I like to focus on the highest part of the panel. That way there's enough tape and I'm able to tuck it underneath each panel. So whenever I'm customizing a shoe, there are areas in my design that are the color of the base of my shoe. I like to utilize that and tape those areas off so that I don't have to end up painting it white, if that makes sense. Taping off this middle panel because I'm going to keep it white, and all the other areas are going to be painted a different color. Make sure you guys tune into my next video because I will be having a more in-depth tutorial on how to use stencils when customizing shoes. Before I airbrush, I like to go in and hand paint all of the areas where each panel meets, because sometimes when you're airbrushing, you'll notice that these areas that I'm painting right now end up having a little bit less paint for some reason. Sometimes when you're airbrushing, you just don't get into those areas and they end up being a little bit lighter than the rest of the panel. After I've airbrushed about 3 coats of that first color, you want to let it dry for a few hours before you start taping off or adding any stencils onto that new layer of paint. If you don't allow enough dry time in between doing this, once you peel off the tape or that stencil, the paint might lift. After masking off all the areas I want to keep gray, now I'm going in with my second color, which is black, and I'm going to do another 2 to 3 coats of that. I just want to make note that whenever you're painting these layers, make sure they're nice and thin and that you allow enough dry time in between painting the next coat. Because if you lay it on too thick or you don't allow it to dry, it'll most likely crack the moment they're worn or as soon as they're creased, and so on. So at this point, now that it's all painted, you want to start taking off your tape and seeing where things might need to get touched up. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and finish the rest of the design by painting the pattern I had in my original sketch. So off camera, I ended up changing that gray color. I noticed that, with all of the colors laid down, it was starting to look more blue than it was gray. So I ended up going in with Angelus Direct's light gray over all of those bluish gray areas. And now the color palette is more spot on with the Raiders theme. After untaping the midsole, you want to check along the edges to see if anything needs to be touched up. Again, no matter how well you tape off your shoe, there is always going to be something to touch up. So I went ahead and did that off camera, and then I'm going to go in with 2 to 3 layers of Liquid Kickz flat top coat. And here's the final product. Hopefully this video taught you guys something new, and you can now use these skills when customizing your next pair of shoes. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments down below and I'll try my best to answer them. Make sure you guys tune in to my next video where I'll be having a more in-depth tutorial on how to make and use stencils on your customs. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to follow me on social media.